I'm Connie Young Yu. I was born in Los Angeles, California, to John and Mary Young, who are American-born. I lived in a house in Whittier when my father was overseas for World War II. He was in China, Burma, India, theater of operations. And my earliest memory are of my mother reading his letters from China. He was a captain in the ordnance. He was a liaison officer, and I was very, very aware of the war as just a toddler. And then my sister, Janie, was 3 years older, and she kind of helped take care of me. But my grandparents, Mr. and Mrs. Yong Song Guang of San Jose, pioneer family, lived with us. So I felt very surrounded by family and history, and people talking about their work and their immigration. So my father moved us to San Francisco in 1947. We came back from the war. He was a Stanford graduate in petroleum engineering. He got his undergraduate degree there too. One of the few Chinese. He graduated with a degree in engineering in 1937. And I look at the pictures of his class and some of the events, and he was the only Chinese. I heard about him living in the Chinese clubhouse, and that was because Chinese students were not allowed to live in the dorms. And this was after 1919, when a Chinese came to Encina Hall and was thrown out bodily by, some good old boys of Stanford. And then the Chinese in the community raised money to build the Chinese clubhouse. This is important because it's part of the things that I've written about and studied. I went to public schools in San Francisco, Washington High, graduated from Mills College in Oakland in '63 in English. And I married Dr. Kuping, or John Yu, a week after graduation. And he was a Kaiser doctor resident. And then we went to New York, where he trained at Sloan Kettering, and we were there for 3 years. So that was my first experience living back east, and I had a very strong feeling that there wasn't the sense of diversity, certainly, and there's no feeling or recognition of Chinese achievements or anything. So when we came back in '67, we lived in Santa Clara, and then a year later, my son Marty was born. So we had 3 children, Jennifer, Jessica, and Marty. And then my brother-in-law from Philippines got accepted to Stanford, and he stayed and lived with us. So we had quite a big household for a young family. And during this time, in '69, it was the centennial of the Transcontinental Railroad, the building of it, the completion, May 10th. And it was just I knew about the Chinese Historical Society because my parents were very active, and they were going to go to Promontory Point as representatives of the Chinese Historical Society. And I always knew about the railroad. I mean, I was always very conscious of it because my parents always talked about pioneer Chinese. My father was born in Heinleinville, Chinatown in San Jose, which was a fenced-in Chinatown. His father fled the burning of the Market Street Chinatown in 1887 and established a new life in this Heinleinville, Chinatown, where my dad was born. And so my father would talk to us about his childhood growing up in San Jose living in this store where workers would come in, the bachelor Chinese. He said he remembered old railroad workers coming into the store. My father was born in 1912, and by then these guys who worked in the 1860s on the railroad were pretty elderly, but they came in and would have a cup of tea and hang out and talk to my grandfather, who was the district association head and also leader of Sun Yat-sen's party. So he was very connected with these bachelors who would donate money, and they would talk about how, how they'd be chased around, if they left Stanford campus, but Stanford would protect them. And so my father always spoke very well of Stanford, and when it was time for him to go to college, his mother said, "Don't go to Berkeley, go Stanford." And it's only because of this feeling that Stanford was a good place to be. It was a safe place to be. Another thing that my father told me about, and I've mentioned it several times in interviews, and it always is cut out because it's never the kind of thing people wanted to hear. But my father said, these old men were involved with the district association, and every 10 years they would go to areas like the foothills of the Sierras, places where the Chinese camps were, and look for the remains of the Chinese who were killed on the railroad. And they would find them because there'd be a certain marker. This is what my father said, a certain kind of marker where they'd look in that area, and the family association would have these maps, and they would dig and they'd find a bottle with a piece of cloth that said, these are the remains of this kinsman killed working on the railroad. And many camps were buried. I mean, the avalanches covered some camps, and the bodies were not found till the spring. But anyway, so this is decades later, they would find the bones, bring them back, and pack them in a sealed jar and put them in a box. And my father told me he saw those boxes. So it must have been that 10-year period, when they came back with these remains. But my father spoke about it very reverently and always said, "Oh, Zhena Yam Gong," I mean, really tragic, really sad and terrible that these people suffered, and that, they were young people, and but because of our connection with the village, they will have a burial in their home, and they are not forgotten. So I grew up with all these, this kind of feeling of some kind of a responsibility. Now, when I was at Mills College, my dream was to become a writer, a novelist, fiction, poetry at least, certainly not these stories of Chinese America. It was nothing that I grew up being incredible. I mean, I was proud of them, but it wasn't something I felt anybody was interested in. Now, in 1969, a few months before the big celebration, I said, I'd really like to write an article, maybe for the Chinese Historical Society, about the railroad. I mean, is there anybody writing it? And my mother said, no, Phil Choi is very busy with the preparations of going, and he's talked about it, but I think it'd be wonderful if you wrote it. And so I wrote this story, and doing lots of research, and the research that I found, I mean, I did not do oral history. What I did was, I figured I'd go to textbooks, and of course they didn't have any, and history books didn't, except in some very negative mention of Chinese workers. I went to Stanford Graduate Library and bought a pass and went to the archives, went to I guess what they would call the newspaper morgue, and at that time, we're talking 69, I actually could pick up these big volumes of the Alta California. And I could have touched them. They didn't even say wear white gloves. I was very careful, though. And there was a person who was so kind who Xeroxed pages for me. But what I found were the reporters' accounts of the building of the railroad. And also accounts of the Chinese being run out of here and there, and, incidents of Chinese being robbed and beaten up. And I learned also that Mark Twain worked for the San Francisco Call and wrote a lot about the Chinese. But that was something I did in college. I wrote a paper on Mark Twain and ended up learning about the Chinese. But back to Stanford, I was so impressed with, and so excited actually to see real quotes. Like there's a quote of a judge who, on the celebration in Sacramento of the completion of the railroad, he made a toast. It was actually Crocker's brother. And he stood up and he said, you know, I'd like to make a toast to the forgotten and neglected, you know, contingent of builders of the railroad, the Chinese. And so I'm paraphrasing, but I was very impressed with that. And then I also saw the, you know, the list of people who participated in the ceremony, none of the Chinese, of course. And so I wrote up the article, and it actually showed, appeared May 10th, 1969, on the Sunday edition of the Examiner. So this paper, actually, my mother went and she bought maybe 1,000 copies. So it was my father just brought it to a PR person, and he got it in the, so there it is, The Golden Spike Unsung Heroes by Connie Young Yu, my first real publication outside of Chinatown, the various booklets there. But so there's this great picture of the High Sierras, you know, and the Chinese with their hats working there, and the Chinese tea carrier. And it mentions, thanks to my mother, who kept reminding me, that I am the great-granddaughter of Wong Sang Lee. It's actually Lee Wong Sang, the last name first. My mother's Lee, a foreman for the Central Pacific Railroad. So the reason why this changed my life is that I started writing nonfiction, and I started writing stories about Chinese America, and also activist stories, because I was involved with the anti-war movement. And I just stopped writing fiction, and so this really directed my my career as a writer. But the stories that my mother told me about Lee Wong Sang really are haunting to me, because I see him as a person only because, and this goes back to another big historic incident, 1906 earthquake. Lee Wong Sang, after working on the railroad as a foreman, and I think he became an agent in ordering food and supplies for Chinese workers on the railroad. And he could speak some English, because I saw his name written in English, Lee Wong Sang, his signature in the National Archives, when he had to testify for all his relatives who were coming back and forth to America. He said, he signed a document saying, yes, this is my daughter-in-law, that's my grandmother, coming to America, 1905, Lee Wong Sang. And so the story is this. My great-grandfather, Lee Wong Sang, has a store called Guang Sang Wo on Commercial Street, and his sons, he had 3 sons working there, and my grandfather, who's the second son, Lee Yuk Sui, he's the one who married, her name is Jung Hing, and she had bound feet, and during the earthquake, she had just given birth to a baby girl, not my mother's older sister, and for her, she was a month old on that day. She was going to have a red eggs and ginger party. And the earthquake hit, and my grandfather he realized that he just had to get the papers from another store. They had another branch of a store on Sacramento Street. He had to run there to get all the papers, his birth certificate, because no one's going to believe a Chinese was born in 1878 in San Francisco. They all said that, you know. So he had his father take care of his wife and baby, and so as the story goes, and as I always say, you don't make these things up. Li Wongsang gets his daughter-in-law and baby, into a wagon, and he realized she's a nursing mom. She has to have water, so he finds some water from a kettle. It had to be boiled, and he got it for her and said, "Please drink this. You must have this water." And my grandmother remembered his kindness. She never forgot it. So she told her mother, who told my mother, and this was that she had a very kind father-in-law. And he was very nice to women. He only had one wife, and when he was very young, after building the railroad, he made sure he sent for her. I think they were sweethearts in China as kids, but, as the story goes. And the other story that I know about him was that when he was working on the railroad, he had accumulated, making $1 a day, a gold piece that he carried around for luck, $20 gold piece. And he carried it, I guess my mother said, wrapped around, in one of these belts. One night he went to the latrine and he lost the gold coin. And she said he cried for a month over that. So these are vivid stories, and I'm sure it's true, but it tells something about the person and how hard the life was, but also the fact that they would tell their story to their son. So I think that's all I know about him, other than the archives where, he gives testimony, and the fact that he did go back to China to build a house. Now, one thing that my mother did emphasize was that, being a railroad worker, of course, people didn't go around bragging, I worked on the railroad. However, she said the money they made was a lot more than other laborers. She said that they would send home part of their fortune. And she said, our Toisan village is one of those railroad villages. And I went back to see it, and she said, "Look at this house." I went back in 91 and also in 94, and she said, "Look at the house with its hexagon windows. Your grandfather, this is the son of the railroad worker, helped design that." And so they had a pride in their village, and they knew what they did. And I have a picture of my great-grandmother, the wife of Li Wongsang, and she's wearing an imperial robe with one of those Mandarin squares with a crane. And the crane is the highest rank for the civil service. And I asked my mother, I said, wow, what's she doing with this imperial robe? And my mother said, my grandfather bought it for her. So at that time, at the end of the Qing dynasty, people could buy the robes, and also they could be, like village officials wearing these. So he probably had one too. My great-grandfather died, 6 years, in the around 1920s, in the 1920s. Yes, my great-grandfather died when he was around 60 in the 1920s.
And he was where when he died?
He was in China.
Went back.
Yeah, he went back. My great-grandfather, it turns out, looking at the immigration papers, made a couple of trips back and forth because he was involved with business and because he was a merchant. And his son, of course, traveled back and forth.
Even though he died in China, his kids stayed in the United States.
Yes.
And you have children that went to Stanford.
Yes.
And so what was that?
Okay, my father went to Stanford, and my husband went to Stanford Medical School. He came from the Philippines, went to Stanford Medical School. And my eldest daughter, Jennifer, went to Stanford. And we were very, very proud when she got in. And she was the first woman to receive a fencing scholarship. And I thought that was a wonderful thing because from the various background that we have had, with my grandmother, Lee, having bound feet and not, going out of the house, except with escorts. And then my other grandmother, who wasn't allowed to vote because she was an alien, and it was the exclusion law wasn't repealed until 1943. So I just felt, I'm very conscious of this, these successes being a triumph, as Chinese. You know, I've always thought about the incredible irony of all this. I really have. And again, the wonderful success. I mean, it's a positive thing, this irony, because the fact that, you know, there's a Chinese clubhouse where the Chinese couldn't live in the dorm, and here's my daughter going to Stanford and living in the dorm, and then in her senior year going to live in Ujima House, which was an African-American dorm. You know, how's that? And and the first dorm that she was in was gorgeous. I mean, you just saw it. And they built Governor's Corner, another new dorm. So for her sophomore year, she was in that. And I remember being very proud when she carried her, following her, when she carried all her fencing gear up to this new dorm. And there was a couple of guys at the foot of the stairs. And my reaction when I see white guys, teenage, young guys, I just thought, you know, I just know what they're thinking when they see Chinese. You know, but that's just my reaction. That's from my generation, you know, growing up in the 50s. So she's walking up very confidently, and when the boys, you know, asked if he could pull out one of her foils, and he pulled out, you know, this sword, and he goes, this is cool. He goes, are you any good? And she goes, yes, I am. Took it from her. And I just thought, that's cool. That's the new generation. And now Jennifer was very aware of what her grandparents were doing with this railroad and all the history with the Chinese Historical Society, because she came with me to the banquets and the events. But when she was very tiny, and she would not remember this, I got a call saying that this was, you know, around a couple days before the train reached Promontory Point. I got a call saying that, you know, turn on your TV at noontime. There's going to be a local special about, you know, San Franciscans going to Promontory Point, and your folks may be on it. And I turned it on, and there on the train, and they're moving like this, or my mother and father, they're smiling. And Jennifer took one look, and she just couldn't believe it. She goes, can they see us? She was just so stunned. And I just told her about what they were doing. And, you know, they're on a train. And so I've repeated that story to her, and she certainly has been very aware of that history. But that trip and that whole event was so important in our lives. Certainly for my parents, it was like a fulfillment of a dream to go there to represent the Chinese for the Chinese Historical Society at Promontory Point, where, you know, 100 years ago, the Chinese were really excluded after all their labors. They were not saying called into the photographs and, you know, interviewed. And here they were, you know, there to present a plaque. And of course, there's another story there because Phil Choi, also representing the Chinese Historical Society as president, was almost totally ignored. And then the keynote speaker was John Volpe, Director, Secretary of Transportation. This is for the May 10th ceremony, and my parents and Phil Choi were all sitting there. And this Secretary Volpe had this incredible rhetoric saying, who but Americans could have, you know, built rails through the Sierras? Who but Americans could have built 10 miles of track in one day? You know, and of course, they were not Americans, they were the Chinese. And Phil Choi was really, really angry. And afterwards, when he was to present a plaque, there was nobody there actually to listen. You know, everybody had left, but so he said, you know, I didn't come all the way to dedicate this plaque to myself. I came to represent the Chinese of America, you know, and so this was covered very widely in the newspapers, front page in the Chronicle, and so more press came out of it, and it was called The Forgotten Men of the Golden Spike. And so from this negligence, from this oversight, we Chinese got a bigger story. Again, the great irony.
So you want to talk about archaeology a little bit?
Yeah, you know, I think I've been involved with the excavation of the Chinatown in San Jose, which my grandfather had a store. My father was born, which is now Japantown. And one of the archaeologists that I've been working with, Rebecca Allen, invited me to go to look at some digs at Donner Pass. And she said, we'd just like you to come and just, be a day consultant and tell us what you think, as from your experience of looking at Chinese artifacts and your experience of the culture. So I drove up with my husband to Truckee, and the archaeologists were there already, and we got a map, and it took us a heck of a time to find it. Turns out it was an area that was owned by the Department of Forestry, and it was on the particular campsite was on a very windy bluff, very rugged, and the plans were that a proposal was that it would be developed into a ski resort. And so here's this Chinese campfire, which was excavated by the Forestry Service and the archaeologists. I went there, and there was this little group, and they were all looking at these stones that were just in a circle, and it looks like a campfire. And we're talking about the winter of 66, 67. And that was one of the most brutal winters in which a lot of campfires were covered, a lot of camps with the tents and people were covered by avalanches. And then, so this camp was uncovered as if, it had been used maybe a few decades earlier. And there are broken pieces of porcelain, pieces that I could pick up, and it looked like celadon or porcelain that you'd see in some of the old Chinatown restaurants. And the archaeology that there's sort of like a very traditional patterns and very traditional style. And then I realized, my goodness, they ate out of rice bowls. They didn't eat out of tin plates. And then I thought about the avalanches, and I did relate back to what my father was talking about with the recovery of bones from the Sierras and sent back to China. And it was to me, a very visceral experience being at that campsite. It was a very windy day and not snowy, thank goodness, but to think of the Chinese working there in this desolate place. Spectacular scenery, but desolate because, great big boulders, rocks. They had to haul in their own supplies and then to work under those conditions, and to think that they'd be tunneling, during the snowstorms.
What did they end up doing with that site?
I think the wonderful outcome of archaeology, the way it is today, and its influence, is that the Department of Forestry is not selling this piece of land. It is not going to be developed. It's going to remain part of the forest, and it will possibly be developed into an area that is like a historic park.
Do you remember what it's called?
Well, it's a campsite near Donner Pass, and then you could see just maybe walking down toward the road, you can see what is called the Chinese Wall, and it's just a huge, huge stone wall near a trestle. And another thing is, for this visit to the site, I carried with me a book that I found in an antique store, and it's called the California Visitor, or it's from 1878, in which it describes a railroad car full of supplies. I guess they were building railroads certainly after the Transcontinental Railroad, and it talked about what a railroad car would have in its in its store. It was like a store. It'd have vermicelli, dried mushroom, dried fish, and rice, and I could just picture it, the car coming in, unloading, and then going back. And that's how the Chinese got their supplies. They did not eat meat and potatoes, as one would guess. So that's why it was very good to have found this book. Also, it had a drawing of Donner Lake and the trestle, and I held it up. I had two, in a position where you can see in the background the real lake, and it was drawn to scale.
Okay, so my name is Jennifer Yu. At my parents' home in Los Altos Hills. So I'm the 5th generation. I am the great-great-granddaughter of Li Wang Sang. Let's see. So I grew up here in California. Grew up here, went to college here, grade school. I could probably stand on the Stanford dish and see everywhere that I've been. I've also lived a little bit in Northern Ireland just for a tiny bit for work. I work at Google right now. I graduated from Stanford. I have a husband and a young daughter.
When did you graduate from Stanford?
In 1987, so quite a while ago.
And you studied?
I studied biology. Unfortunately, I didn't use that degree at all, but I did take what I learned in general at Stanford.
So tell me generally what your experience was like at Stanford.
Oh, let's see. I had a lovely experience. One is I had the opportunity to be on the fencing team. So I went there on a fencing scholarship. So I had the nice experience of being involved in a sports team as well as academics. I wasn't very good at biology, but I did like it quite a bit. And afterwards, after I graduated, I wasn't quite sure what I wanted to do after that. And I ended up working as a temporary worker for a computer company at the time, which ended up being Next Software, which was run by Steve Jobs. And that's how I got to technology at the time.
And on the Stanford campus, did you actually ever look at the golden spike that's there?
I'm sure I did at some point. I'm sure I'm sure it was probably part of some scavenger hunt that I was involved in way back when. We also looked at, the museum, of course, and I've been there just recently at the Cantor Museum too, to see a bit about the Stanford family there, which is a little bit interesting. I always felt like, you think of the Stanford tree and the Hoover Tower, but from my family knowing a little bit more about the Stanford history and the railroads and the role of the Chinese worker there was always made it a little bit more different. Like when you look at Cantor, you see one of the most striking things is a beautiful display of all Mrs. Stanford's jewelry. And all the things that they had in their beautiful garden, and just knowing a little bit more about where that came from, I thought was always interesting. I had an advantage in that way.
Do you remember anybody talking about the railroad at Stanford? I mean, in your general history?
I would have to say no. I don't think that really came up that often. I think when there's certainly about labor discussions and about Chinese history would come up, but in general, I would say probably just being in biology, maybe not. Yeah.
Tell me about your fencing career.
Oh, let's see. So I got into fencing from my mom, and somehow the whole family and cousins got into that too. So with my sister, my brother, and 3 or 4 other cousins that tried fencing. So I fenced a weapon of foil. I did pretty well at regional championships. I was an All-American one year, and then I competed nationally as well, and a little bit internationally. Oh, and I was national champion too, one year also.
What year was that?
That was 1989.
So you were an upperclassman, or?
I fulfilled my high school dream. I was a national champion in 1990, and I was also a second alternate on the Olympic team.
And so you've been back to China. You've
Yes.
been back to your ancestral village.
Yes, I was lucky enough. One is I went on my own after college, for my own trip there too. And then I had a second chance to go with my family and my grandmother. And we had, and some cousins, and really toured the family village.
And
Oh,
the opportunities.
completely. It was an adventure, it was an eye-opener. I think you just realize too what kind of courage and leap of faith it took for people to come so far. And what an opportunity, what a gift you've been given to. China is so big, and I think one of these things, it's hard to feel like an individual, and I think that's one thing that we really appreciate back at home too. But it just made me so thankful that our great-great-grandparent had immigrated over here too.
And what do you know about your great-great-grandfather? Anything? Any stories?
Only the ones that my mom has told me too. I think also my memories are of our great-great-grandmother too, Bach, and how hard she worked and that she lived independently. She injured her eye, and we also thought It was a little bit scary looking, but she was always so gentle about it with us, and always had little treats, and had cute little vests on. And I remember it was an accident that hurt her eye, was chopping wood, and we thought, wow, she must have been strong back then to chop wood all by herself too.
Do you know where they lived? I mean, do you remember where they spent their life in San Francisco?
No, I don't. I mean, I just know we just went and visited their apartment. We were pretty little back then. Yeah, sure. So I guess my memories of how I learned about Chinese history was, of course, from my mom and through my grandfather and grandmother. So we went to Angel Island. We took road trips. We were going up to places far up north, and we managed to find the only Chinese restaurant there. Learn a bit more about the history. I learned about the gold up there. I think my gong would always talk about Chinese achievements too, in a really interesting way. And at interesting times, we were watching this one horror film where at the key moment, this man is pinned by 2 railroad cars, and we're all just closing our eyes, and Gong looks and goes, "Hey, did you know the Chinese invented that fixture?" And that just took it out. We weren't scared anymore. But he could manage to see that in anything about railroads or that type of thing. So I would say that's how we learned things from him.
So he wouldn't lecture you; he would just sort of blend it into the.
Yeah, it was so interesting. Or he'd take us to different places. He'd talk about things. And it was never. It was never boring. It was always interesting. It was always personal stories too, and he just knew so much. Also, I remember touring the soy sauce factory, and that was a big thrill too. Just seeing the big vats there, and just how big it was to be in a real soy sauce factory was kind of a thrill too.
And you have a daughter.
Yes, I do.
And so what part of the legacy will you pass on to her? Do you think?
Oh, I think there's certain, just like this celebrations, she's 3 years old, some of this, I think, just cultural celebrations. So one is Chinese New Year's, things like that. And I think to try to take her as she grows older to the same things we did, which is Angel Island. She's been to a number of Chinese historical events too. She knows her middle name in Chinese. So just I think those things to start her young and have that just be part of what we do, and to take advantage of all the history in the area.
But also, Jennifer, you've done a lot of volunteer work. I mean, you've been great support in some of these historical events, and like the Woodside Walls.
Okay, you want me to talk about that? Okay. Oh, so an example of one I would say where we've taken Clementine is over at the Woodside Walls, where the walls are built by Chinese workers there, and it's in a beautiful area too, near the stables. And so she's been an event in that, I think, twice now, to be a participant, and also just to just walk around the area too. So as she goes to these types of things, we would definitely talk to her about the history there.
So you work at Google now.
Yeah.
What do you see as the Stanford Google link? Do you see a link there?
Well, I think just because the founders are from Stanford too, that you see a lot of people in the Bay Area. They also try to aim for diversity. So there's Asian American groups for Googlers. There's all different types too. So I think you see a lot of local people. But yeah, I think there's tons of people. There's also a huge Berkeley contingent also. So you definitely see the Berkeley, Stanford, come out every once in a while too.
Do they work together?
They do work together too. Yeah. Yeah.
Feeling like you're the only.
Oh, sure. Okay. So growing up in our grade school, there was one other Chinese boy at the time, but that was about the number when a lot of other Chinese families. My parents did enroll us in Chinese school, but even then, I think there was a lot of newer immigrant families. So I think they were enrolled because they could speak obviously Chinese fluently, but they wanted to have other Chinese kids to play with. But over time, I think once we got to junior high and grade school, we did see more Chinese immigrants over here, and also just Asians of Vietnamese, East Indians as well too. So it definitely became more diverse over time.
So Stanford is now, they say, 51% people of color.
Which is a really good thing too.
Yeah. What was your experience like?
Boy, I think certainly didn't feel that way when I was there. I mean, this is many years. It certainly didn't feel like that. And I think I also lived at Ujima, which is the African American dorm too. I think it was definitely diverse, but probably not as much as it is now.
Did that change your perspective on the world at all? I mean, did it kind of...
You know, I think because I was just raised with diversity in mind too, right? Which is that one, I think you felt confident about who you were. And the other thing is just being aware of that too. Living in Ujima House was an interesting experience for me as well too, to be immersed in a different type of culture and a different awareness.
Was that a choice to stay in that?
Yeah, it was, yeah. They had an Asian American house, but I thought, you know, some other person could go there too. Yeah. Yeah, I think, you know, you definitely got the people pulling at their eyelids, you know, and saying chinky and things like that. They definitely made fun of you for just the way you look, I would say too. But I think just having kind of a strong background and identity didn't bother us too much also too. You know, by contrast, I had, later on in college, I had a roommate who was a rich immigrant from Korea, and he felt really compelled to have the eyelid surgery and that type of thing. His whole family did it too. So I think just having a strong identity was definitely helpful. I think the only prejudice I did really feel was actually when I was working briefly in Northern Ireland. Two little kids came up as I came out of the gym and they said, "Hey, Chunky." And I thought, I'm being cussed out by a 5-year-old. And then somebody said, "That's not very nice to call her Chinky. How would you like to be called Chubby?" And I realized they were calling me Chinky. And I was like, I'd much rather be called Chinky than Chubby, which I'm not sure if that's right or not. But anyway, that is my experience there, where I got called out by a 5-year-old in Northern Ireland. But otherwise, I think because this area is so diverse, because I think we just have a bit more confidence here, and because we know when sometimes people react that way with prejudice, where it's coming from, I think we've been, again, benefiting from our background here in history.
So you have a strong feeling of having roots in America
Mm-hmm.
and part of this whole technology revolution. Do you feel that? I mean, working for Google and, you know, we always talk about competition with China, and this is America, you know. Just wanted to know how you feel about kind of conflict or loyalty or, you know, idea.
You know, I think without getting, you know, I'm just one of the many people that work at Google too, but I think one thing that where China does come up actually was in some areas where they're being suspected of trying to break in privacy attempts or security breaches there. So, you know, I don't know if it's specifically about Google in China, or I'm not sure. I'm not sure what you're...
No, I think that you're answering the question.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the fact that, you know, it's a global world.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's hard not to think of, China as just one country. There's so many other pieces about it too. But being in a business, that's the aspect that we see, is China as a government, or China as, enforcing certain business policies, not the people themselves, I would say, and just in a business environment.
And do you find that all this is very exciting? You know, that there's that great things are going to happen, that continually do
I think
things?
Yeah, I think so, definitely. I think just in the Valley in general, I think we feel that too, especially now. And we've been through a number of downturns, and this really is like, it feels more like one of the upturns. If I can just go back to the Google, one thing too is there are 4 other Jennifer Yus. So if you want to look for diversity, we get each other's email all the time. I've never been to a place where there's 4 other Jennifer Yus. So I would say that's one way just to measure diversity there in my small world.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Actually.
Yeah, and when I worked in Northern Ireland too, the person that reported to me, he when I told him this man, he looked shocked. I said, "Oh, do you know?" And he said, "Oh, my girlfriend, his boss is named Jennifer Yu. She's a doctor who came over from Taiwan." So it just shows like kind of how people have immigrated even into Northern Ireland, and there happens to be Yus everywhere. Yeah, sure.
Go ahead.
Oh, when I was thinking about Stanford, I was thinking one thing I'm very proud of is I can say my grandfather went to Stanford. You know, way back then he went to Stanford and graduated with a degree in petroleum engineering. I thought that was always great to have that in my roots. And then, of course, my dad went to med school there, coming from Shanghai in the Philippines. So I felt lucky to be the third generation attending there too. And as far as classes, I felt like I had, unlike a lot of people that, want to continue, maybe for the first time, to take an advantage of such a really strong academic environment to learn about their Asian American roots or history. I ended up taking different courses. I took American religions because I felt that, for me, that was the gap. But for a lot of people, this is kind of an awakening for them. But I felt kind of I at least had some history there to go into with college. Had, Uncle Andrew, right, too, and my cousins, so I can talk about that too, right? So, yeah.
Can I add that?
Sure.
Okay, just say that, extended
I
family.
mean, it's kind of mind bending to think, right?
Mm-hmm.
If basically, if the Chinese labor did not arrive in
Mm-hmm.
the United States, the railroad probably would have been completed
Right.
at that time,
Right.
and the benefit that Leland Stanford got from the railroad
Right,
would have
right.
happened, and then this university would happen. So I don't know.
Yeah, and I can't say one thing about Stanford here too is, you hear about how he, grew this empire and became the governor, but just knowing the one aspect, the one role that Chinese played in that, and the labor there too, it was always felt like it was interesting. And I remember growing up, we always had the picture. My mom had the picture of the railroad, the final meeting of the railroad there too, and how that linked up also.
And there are Chinese in the picture.
And there's no Chinese in the picture too. And all the things we had were either things from, one photograph that had been turned into a panel in a quilt, right? So these were all things that had to be dug up and archived and found, found things, or not things that are, part of, the sort of natural, story that people get, like right out of textbooks. It had to go a little bit deeper than that too.
And so, obviously your mom is deeply into the history. And
Yeah.
why do you think it's important for her to keep this barn full of archives and to keep these stories alive?
Because I don't think there's anywhere else that it's there, right? Not yet. I mean, I think there's certainly a lot of, in academics and discipline, but I think a lot of that, like a lot of history, comes from personal stories and grassroots and connections into the community too, and just a lot of outreach. So I think that's important. We look at, and there's a lot of stuff out there, like some of the things my mom, for her birthday, we've gotten her stuff that, if you look on eBay, it's listed as racist Chinese memorabilia. I mean, it's really embarrassing to have those searches, but the material's out there. People have it there. And so I think, the research continues in that way too.